Hello and welcome to another session on Religious Studies AS on the Philosophy of Religion module. Today we are going to look at a response to the problem of evil and suffering, and we'll be concentrating on the Theodicy of Irenaeus, the Irenaean Theodicy, and we hope to reinforce and develop your understanding of how Irenaeus responds to the problem of evil and suffering, and trying to give us an answer for why God has allowed evil and suffering into this world. And we will have a brief session on looking at how to evaluate two of the possible themes within the Irenaean Theodicy. So let's have a quick look at the specification and have a look at what the examining board expects you to understand on the Irenaean type theodicies. So the first idea is the veil of soul making, that human beings have been created imperfect, the idea of epistemic distance, the second order goods, the eschatological justification, and then you need to have a look at some of the challenges to the Irenaean Theodicy, the concept of universal salvation as being unjust, that evil and suffering should not be used as a tool by an omnibenevolent God, an all-loving God, the immensity of suffering, and the unequal distribution of evil and suffering. So those are your main points of reference to the the Irenaean Theodicy, and then the bullet points at the bottom. These two are the two the B questions that you need to address on this topic: whether the Irenaean type theodicies are credible in the 21st century, and to what extent to which the Irenaean theodicy succeeds to defend the theistic, the classical God within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So on this slide, I've included a summary really of the main points that we have looked at from the specification. Why don't you press the pause button on this presentation and on this slide and see if you can explain some of the illustrations, some of the terms and the quotations on this page to see how much you already understand on the Irenaean Theodicy. Okay, hopefully you were able to explain some of the images or terms on this slide. I will go over them in the following slides. So there is an illustration of Irenaeus. We have the quote that is a base for the Theodicy. We will have a look at that quotation in the next slide. Just to remind you that a theodicy is an argument that tries to defend God in the face of evil and suffering in the world, the way of trying to justify a loving God in a world full of evil and suffering. That's a small illustration that I used to try and convey what Irenaeus was trying to say. And then a more modern version or development of the Irenaean Theodicy, you need to know about John Hick's development. So we need to have a look and make sure that you understand the valley or the veil of soul making, epistemic distance, eschatological justification, and the analogy that Irenaeus used to actually explain his theodicy. So let's have a look at the Theodicy in a bit more depth. So as you can see, Irenaeus, he was an archbishop of Lyon, and those are his dates. So in his Theodicy, unlike Augustine, Irenaeus believed that evil exists intentionally in the world. So if you have studied the Augustinian Theodicy, you may remember that the idea of privation, the lack of good, is what we call evil or suffering. So in a way, he denies that God created evil and suffering. But Irenaeus, he does actually say that God did create evil and suffering, and that was intentional. It was a part of the creation process, and it was there because he is an all-loving God, and that he intentionally placed it. There was a reason why evil and suffering was created and why it's apparent in this world. The reason, according to Irenaeus, is to try and develop qualities within human beings so that they could perfect themselves spiritually. So there is a reason why we see suffering and evil within this world. So God has created evil and suffering, and it is here for a reason. God didn't create people to be perfect from the beginning. Each person has a task or a challenge, if you want, to try and perfect themselves while they are here on earth. So Irenaeus based his Theodicy, it's based on the interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 verse 26 within the Bible, and that quotation can be seen below. So it's important that you understand what he is trying to explain and trying to defend God by using the quote. God said, "Let us make man in my image and after in my likeness." So let us have a look at the quotation from the Bible that is a base for the Irenaean Theodicy. So the quotation says, God said, "Let us make man in my image and after in my likeness." So Irenaeus has looked at the quotation, and he's trying to concentrate on two words within the quotation. The quotation obviously refers to God creating Adam, the first man. And what's key here is that we look at the word "in my image" and "likeness." And according to Irenaeus, he can see that there is a difference and a development between the word image, being in God's image, and being like God. And he says that this sentence actually explains everything that we need to know about evil and suffering in the world. The challenge which I referred to in the last slide, our challenge on this earth is to try and perfect ourselves, perfect our soul, and become closer to God. We come into the world in the image of God, which shows us that we have some glimpses of God and the characteristics of God, but our knowledge of God is far from perfect, and we are supposed to try and perfect our soul, perfect ourselves and our knowledge of God, and become closer to Him by the time that we actually leave this world. And that is progressing to be like God. So what I've tried to try and show within this diagram here, we come into the world imperfectly in God's image, and our task from the time we come into the world is to try and progress, try and develop, try and perfect our soul and become closer to God in our understanding of God. So by the time that we leave the world, that we leave on God's likeness. And the way that we actually perfect ourselves and to develop from the image of God into likeness is to go through evil and suffering, looking at choices of good and bad that we need to be making, and trying to actually persevere through evil and suffering throughout our lives. The idea of no pain, no gain comes here. Going through the challenges of evil and suffering in our lives does make us stronger and makes us closer, and it takes us closer to God in our understanding. It's a way of perfecting the soul. So basically, that's the reason why evil and suffering is here. It's here to help us to perfect our soul and to make sure that we progress by the end of our time on earth, that we have progressed from the image of God to become like God, so that we then could, in the afterlife, could join God in heaven. So let us have a look at some notes that will explain the idea of the development of image to the likeness of God that we have discussed in the previous slide. So for Irenaeus, he saw that this life was a place for human beings to develop their potential and to grow and develop from being in the image of God to be like the perfection of God, which is the likeness of God. He sees that the development in the words image to likeness, so there was a progression, a perfection maybe from developing from being in the image of God to the likeness of God. So people came into the world, and they come into the world in the image of God, and they are supposed to use life as a way of improving and perfecting themselves to come in the likeness of God, to be closer to God and more like him and to understand him better. So when people come into the world, they are far from God. There is a distance between God and people within their knowledge of God. They are meant to use life's experiences as a way of becoming like God and to unite with him by the time they leave this world. We are to try and mature ourselves spiritually while we are on earth. That is our challenge. Just as a parent would give freedom for their child to sometimes suffer in order to teach them and trying to perfect their behavior and understanding of the world, God does the same with his children, being humanity. So how do we perfect ourselves? So people would do this by facing various problems and decisions that they make when facing these challenges in the world. So evil and suffering are here to test us and to make us try and face some of the problems and make the right decisions when it comes to moral dilemmas that we face. So for every moral decision that we face, where a good decision is made completely freely from free will, then that individual develops spiritual maturity. So that implies the development and the progress of trying to develop from being in the image of God to the likeness of God. Our decisions in life using free will to make good decisions develop ourselves and perfect our morality. So again, that shows the development that we use evil and suffering within this world and moral and good and bad decisions to try and develop ourselves and perfect ourselves whilst we're on this earth. Obviously, some people would not make good decisions with their free will, and so this is where moral evil comes in the world, when people use their free will and decide to do bad things, and that is where evil and suffering comes, as we've seen obviously from Adam and Eve when they eat the fruit from the forbidden fruit from the tree. So because of bad decisions some people make. This is where moral evil comes into the world. It's a direct result of free will. So evil is a necessary aspect in life which gives human beings the opportunity to develop and to perfect themselves, therefore moving from the image of God to the likeness of God by the time we leave this world. So without evil, there would be no value to the decisions that are made. For a person, for example, for a person would not appreciate what it's like to being healthy unless they have suffered from some sort of illness. Some good qualities such as courage, patience and perseverance cannot be developed if there is no challenge in life in order to develop these qualities. So they are necessary for us to try and perfect and develop ourselves. So for Irenaeus, the ability of human beings to choose completely freely to do good was key to fulfilling God's purpose for his creation. He calls this a secondary goodness, which is the moral goodness that comes from resisting and overcoming evil decisions and perfecting ourselves and making good choices in life. God cannot stop people from making bad decisions because we have free will. If he stopped them, we wouldn't have free will. So this is where moral evil comes from. He has to allow some people to make bad moral decisions, therefore causing suffering on others. So Irenaeus tries to explain his theodicy further by trying to use an analogy. And the analogy is a sculptor over there working on his sculpture. And the sculptor is trying to perfect and mold the sculpture into a better image. So God is, in the analogy, God is the sculptor and people are the sculpture. So he's there meticulously working on the sculpture and trying to make it better, making it perfect. And that implies the idea that God is trying to mold and to perfect us and our souls on earth. And the way that he does that is looking at is using evil and suffering, looking at how we make moral decisions between good and evil, and how we cope with suffering and try and persevere through suffering so that it makes us stronger by the time that we end our lives on earth. He does end his theodicy on a hopeful note. He's trying to establish and trying to stress that God is a just God. He is an all-loving God, and he is a merciful God. So he's trying to protect the characteristics that belong to God in his theodicy. He says that those who have lived a good life on earth, who have managed to progress from being the image of God to the likeness of God, they will be rewarded and they will go to heaven. But he does then go on and said that those who've made bad immoral decisions, that they will be punished in hell. But because he is a merciful and loving God, that will not be eternally. They will not be in hell forever. They will be purified and they will eventually be perfected and they will become to be in the likeness of God after they have left this earth. So this is what we call the eschatological justification. All people will eventually be saved by God, and he will be perfecting them to be in the likeness of God, and maybe not in this life, but in the next life. So we've had a look at the main points within the Irenaean Theodicy, but you need to be aware as well of John Hick and his development of the Irenaean Theodicy. It's sometimes referred to the soul-making valley or the soul-making veil. So his development of the theodicy can be seen in the book Evil and the God of Love, which was published in 1966. He described the Irenaean Theodicy as a theodicy which develops the soul. So again, implying the idea that we are here to try and develop and perfect our soul whilst we are on earth, which he refers to as a vale or a valley. So the world is seen as a vale or a valley where the soul can be developed and perfected. Epistemic distance is a term that he has coined for the distance that is between the knowledge of and understanding of God and humans. So because of free will, God had to keep a distance from humanity in order for them to make the right decisions. This gave human beings the freedom to try and respond to God in their own way. God cannot he could not have created a perfect spiritual human being, because goodness has to be developed from free choice, and this is much more valuable than goodness that had already been created for us. We are not puppets to God. We don't do we're not like robots that we perform in a good way that he would be expecting of us. He has given us freedom to try and follow his rules and commandments, or again, we have the freedom to not follow them. And this freedom was necessary for people to be able to try and perfect and develop them ways in a way to try and make good decisions in life. So people must have been given the opportunity to understand and to know God and to get closer to him. This is again the development to the likeness of God, to try and progress from the image of God to the likeness of God. So again, trying to use free will in a way of trying to make better or good decisions so that we can try and become closer to God. But at the beginning, when you come to the image of God, to the world as and the image of God, we are at a distance, an epistemic distance from God. Hick agreed that God's mercy and love allows human beings to be complete, to complete the process of trying to perfect themselves spiritually. They can do it in this life on earth, but if they don't succeed in doing it on earth, there is a chance of actually perfecting yourself spiritually in the next life as well. So this is what we call the eschatological justification. Heaven is the goal, the aim for all people, be they good or bad. So even bad people who have made bad immoral decisions, they will be given the chance to reach heaven in the end. So God uses this life to mold people to be better people. Those who have rejected God will be punished after death. They will go to hell. But because God is willing to save people from suffering in the next life, he has given the opportunity for everybody to be forgiven, even after death. So some people don't get the chance to perfect the soul during their life on earth. Their life may have been short, so obviously they will be given the opportunity in the afterlife to actually try and perfect and develop their soul. So God is a good God. He's a just God, while by allowing them to be perfected in the next life. Even people in hell will be given a chance to perfect their souls, because he is an all-loving God. Hell is not an eternity. They will be given a chance to reach heaven. So let us have a brief look at some of the evaluation topics that could come up for you. The first one is, are Irenaean type theodicies, are they credible in the 21st century? So that is your key word to try and use in your evaluation, that the theodicies are credible or that they are not. So again, there's a problem here because it's based on a specific quotation verse in the Bible on God creating creating Adam to be in the image of God, and then the progression to the likeness of God in Genesis 1:26. It depends really on the credibilities. If you actually believe that that actually did happen, it was an historical event, or not. Obviously, if the person believes that Genesis 1:26 did historically happen, then it is more credible. But if you believe that it's a myth and that it wasn't history, then it would be less credible for a person. So we'll have a look first at the three main things that you could discuss to try and prove that some people would say that it would be credible in the 21st century. The first point being that there are modern adaptations of the theodicy. And the fact that you have people like Hick who have actually tried to develop the theodicy strengthens the credibility of the theodicy. If nobody had tried to develop the theodicy, then obviously that would be a weakness for the theodicy. So the fact that we have modern adaptations is a good thing. It's obviously something that they feel that makes sense, and that they adapt and develop in the modern era. The second point is the idea that we come into the world as being imperfect and that we try to perfect ourselves. That actually fits in with scientific theories such as evolution and natural selection. So they goes hand in hand with the progress within the development within evolution and natural selection. They go together. And the third point is that the idea of developing spiritual maturity while we are here on earth echoes the beliefs of many religions, not just Christianity. So that many religions do actually teach that we are here to try and perfect ourselves by the time that we actually leave this world. On the other hand, you do have challenges to the Irenaean Theodicy, and you could use these arguments to try and prove that the Theodicy is not credible in the 21st century. So we'll have a quick look at some of these arguments. The first one is developed by Dewi Phillips, who says that suffering should not come from an all-loving God. If God is an omnibenevolent God, an all-loving God, then he shouldn't want to harm anyone, and you cannot justify that evil and suffering has been a tool for him to try and perfect people. It's a cruel way of trying to perfect people here on earth. The second point is the idea that the reward of heaven as for spiritual perfection, from moving from the image of God to the likeness of God, does not make up for the intense suffering that some people face. So what is the point of such intense suffering in this world? A loving God would not make us suffer that much. The third point, that suffering is not shared fairly. Why do some people suffer more than others? So this suggests an inconsistency in the mechanism of God's perfection. If the world was perfect and God was perfect, then people would suffer the same amount. Why do some people suffer more than others? The next point, if all human beings are going to eventually reach perfection, coming to become in the likeness of God, without taking into account what they have done in the past, bad decisions, how does this encourage good moral behavior here and now? What is the point of free will if everyone eventually gets rewarded and everyone perfects their soul? The next point, the concept of universal salvation, that everybody's going to be saved. It all undermines the effort of human beings to develop their own maturity. If God is ultimately going to place everyone in a state of perfection and that everybody goes to heaven, doesn't this show that free will is limited? I.e., human beings do not have the freedom to refuse to perfect themselves spiritually. If everybody is going to be saved at the end, then God has made this decision for us that everybody will be going to heaven, and that restricts on free will. Next, if everyone is forgiven at the end, then it makes the sacrifice, the death of Jesus, as pointless. So Jesus being the Son of God, why did he have to come to this world? And he came to the world to offer forgiveness for those who believed in him. But if everybody is going to be saved at the end, then what was the point of Jesus dying on the cross? There was no need for him to die for us if everybody is forgiven in the end anyway. The next argument. The intensity of suffering that is experienced makes the theodicy to be one that breaks the soul, not one that creates or makes the soul. It's commonly referred to as soul-breaking theodicy, not a soul-making. So that's something that you could refer to. You can link this to the intense suffering that we see in the world. And the intensity of suffering is too great to be seen as a good thing that perfects people. So you have to question yourself, couldn't a perfect God have chosen an easier way to try and perfect people here on earth? And the last point is the idea of premature deaths. How are the individuals who die young given the opportunity to perfect themselves on earth, since their life is short? But again, you could answer that by referring to the eschatological justification, saying that God actually, because he's a just, loving God, he actually gives people a chance to try and perfect themselves, if not in this world, but in the next world. So those are the points you could use to try and challenge the theodicy. And there you have the main arguments there for the credibility of the Irenaean Theodicy in the 21st century. So the second evaluation asks if the Irenaean Theodicy succeeds to actually defend the classical theistic God, the characteristics that belong to a classical theistic God. So here are some of the characteristics that you could refer to: an almighty, omniscient God, a merciful God, an omnibenevolent and all-loving God, a creator God, a fair or a just God, or a righteous God. Does the Irenaean Theodicy defend these characteristics of God? So, as you can see from the specification, to what extent does Irenaeus Theodicy succeed in defending the God of classical theism? So here are some of the characteristics we mentioned in the previous slide. Again, you could refer here to the problem of the historical authenticity of Genesis 1:26. obviously it's based on a part of the creation narrative in the Bible. His arguments are based on that sentence, so if it's not historically true, then it does not protect the classical theistic God. Let's have a look at some of the points you could refer to as succeeding to try and defend God. The all-loving characteristic nature of God. God has given us suffering here to be able to improve and to perfect themselves, to get closer to God and to be able to go to heaven. So he's given us a chance. So that's an all-loving God, even though that he uses suffering, which is a cruel way of trying to get us to perfect our ways. So some would argue, counter argument for that one, saying, well, is it really a kind, a fair, and a loving God that would use such thing as suffering and evil to try and perfect us? The second argument, the God of mercy, is trying to show that God is a merciful God. John Hick does say that God has given everybody a chance to be saved, even after death, even people who have made bad decisions, which links to the merciful and all-loving God. He does love everyone. Even people who have made bad decisions will go to heaven at the end. The other side of the arguments, looking at points of view that shows that he has not succeeded in defending the characteristics of the classical theistic God. The idea of a just, a fair God. The idea that bad or evil people will go to heaven in the end. That does not seem fair. Where is free will that God gave us? Sinners should have the right to choose hell and to reject heaven. And it doesn't seem fair, the second point, that forgiveness is given to people who have made bad decisions or who have chosen to reject God whilst they were on earth. So giving forgiveness to bad or evil people is not fair. Is this a just or a fair God? Why should we live a good life if everybody's going to be forgiven anyway at the end? What is the reward for us who choose to live life in a good way here on earth if bad people do go to end up in heaven at the end? The third point, a just or a fair God. Why do some people suffer more than others? That doesn't seem fair. And then again, we come back to Phillips saying that suffering should not and could not come from an all-loving God. They contrast on it's a paradox that an all-loving God would use suffering and evil to try and help us. So you cannot justify that. Again, coming back to the idea of Jesus being the Son of God, what was the point of his suffering? If everybody is ultimately going to be saved. And the last point is the idea of intense suffering. Intense suffering in the world is soul breaking. It's not soul making. It doesn't help to perfect your soul. It disheartens people because of the intense suffering in this world. And here is an example of some points that you could include in an answer on a question, an evaluation question, stating that Irenaean type theodicies are still credible in the 21st century. So those are some essay plans, arguments that you could actually include into your answer. That's another example for you for an A question. Explain how Irenaean type theodicies provide a response to the problem of evil. That's a plan that was given by the WJEC. So obviously, if you have a look at the specification once again, I hope you see that we have gone through the main points within the specification and the last two evaluations on the Irenaean Theodicy. Why don't you try and create a mind map for yourself that you can actually try and give a summary of the Theodicy, looking at Genesis 1:26, trying to explain what this verse teaches and how Irenaeus tries to explain why evil and suffering is here and the progress between the image of God and the likeness of God. And then could you actually explain the developments by John Heck, the soul-making veil or valley, and the eschatological justification that everybody will be saved in the end. And then your evaluation, you could try and list your main strengths that you feel are strengths and the weaknesses, and then you will be able to use this as revision. Everything within the Irenaean Theodicy is one piece of paper for you. Okay then, hopefully we have looked at the main ideas within the Theodicy and we have reinforced your understanding of the Irenaean Theodicy. Bye for now.